Greetings, dear listeners. In recent episodes, Wisdom of Crowds has been covering the political challenges and the possible constitutional crisis that's been emerging in the American scene. Today's episode will be a bit different. It looks forward with hope toward the future. Our guest today is Yoni APPELBAUM, an American historian and staff writer at The Atlantic magazine. His new book, titled Stuck: How the Privileged and Propertied Broke the Engine of American Opportunity, deals with the different ways that the American dream has been stymied by the consolidation of property and money by the upper middle class. But the book is not a diatribe. It's a hopeful program about how we can make America better. Sam and Damir engage in this lively conversation with Yoni, which will leave you looking at America in a different and more hopeful way. Before we get started, a reminder to head on over to wisdomofcrowds.live and consider becoming a paying subscriber if you're not one yet. You'll get access to, among other things, the whole conversation, along with other subscriber-only benefits. And don't forget to give us a like and a review on your favorite podcast app. With all that out of the way, on to the show.
I'm just curious when you started writing this book, and, you know, around what time and what the sort of triggers were to, you know, get you thinking about these issues.
Yeah, I started thinking about this more than a decade ago. I was still an academic. I was living in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in an apartment that was a little too small for my family already and cost a little bit more than we could actually afford. And I was looking out the window, and I knew something as a historian about the neighborhood in which I lived. I knew that it was a really special place, that for more than 100 years, it was the place where the children of immigrants had come to find that first rung on the ladder of opportunity and start climbing. Sociologists had come and studied the neighborhood because it was so remarkable for this. They had coined a term, zone of emergence, and then applied that. You can find a zone of emergence in almost every 20th century American city, the neighborhood where people sort of land off the boat or when they're looking for new opportunities, and then they start climbing. But by the time I lived there, it was not a zone of emergence, right? I guess it had fully emerged. It was a professional class neighborhood. And instead of my building housing immigrants and the children of immigrants, it housed, finance types and lawyers and impecunious grad students. And so something fundamental had changed. And if one neighborhood changes, I don't think that's a tragedy. But if the zones of emergence all across America are changing, that's really alarming to me, actually. And so I did what you do if you're a historian. I started digging, and eventually I produced this book.
And I mean, the question, I guess, that obviously this is a labor of love that's been gestating for a while. It's striking in the sense that, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, it comes out at the same time as Ezra's book, also on this question of abundance. And I know they started working on it before, like, this current moment. I mean, as you were sort of, I imagine, like, really putting the finishing touches on the book, the Biden administration is in full swing. To what extent did you envision it? I mean, again, I believe that Ezra Klein's book, I don't know him personally, also is was not meant to be sort of a critique of the moment of where the Democrats are, and is now being read more into that. To what extent did you find yourself writing, I guess, a political book, in a sense that it is a critique of progressive ideas gone wrong, or at least excesses and sort of knock-on effects, unintended consequences that have contributed to a much bigger problem, which you outline in the book, which is this crisis of mobility and tied to the housing crisis in the country. So just tell us a little bit about how in writing the book and, in finishing the book in this incredible moment in American history, how's all that sort of jibing?
And you use the word abundance a whole bunch in the book too, which is kind of like either a coincidence or not a coincidence, depending on the situation.
You know, I set out to write this book as a political book, but it was a different kind of politics I was trying to address. I had a sense that something had gone profoundly wrong in America. And that was a somewhat contrarian thought during the Obama years when I embarked on this project. And by the time I actually had a chance to sit and write the thing, it had become something closer to conventional wisdom. And so to the extent that this book and other books are ripening simultaneously, I think it's because a lot of Americans have come to share that conviction that the arc of history is long and it bends in all kinds of unexpected directions. And we don't know where it's going next, but we can look at what's gone wrong over the last 50 years, try to figure out why many of the projects that progressives embarked on with great optimism 50 years ago have yielded a set of outcomes that are really different than they intended, and think about what it was that had made America so successful for so long, and what we have changed fairly recently that has altered that.
Yeah. So why don't you lay out the theory of the case then? I think both specifically about housing policy, but our sort of core way that we contend on this podcast and in general with the publication is really trying to press our primary convictions and principles. So give us not just the argument you're making about housing or the policy side, but really what's motivating it and how's that working, and then we can argue at that level.
Great. The core claim of this book is that the weirdest thing about America, the most precious thing about America, the freedom on which all of our other freedoms were founded, was the freedom to move. And that this is a historically strange thing, that if you go to the lands from which most Americans arrived, at most times and places, your identities were inherited at birth. You were tied to a particular place. You inherited a particular spot in the social hierarchy, often an occupation, a religion, and you were tied to that through your whole life. You could look out the church window and see this row of gravestones that had your family name on it, and you expected to be buried there, and you thought your great-grandkids would be buried there. You were tied to a particular place. Everything about you was more or less inherited. That's how the world worked. In America, for a bunch of particular, largely accidental historical reasons we can get into, we break free of that. It takes us about 200 years to do it. But we radically alter this. We say people can move where they want. And by moving, they have the right to construct their own identities. This is what American individualism means. Not that we are an atomistic people, but that we are people who define our own identities through chosen affiliations. And we do that in all kinds of ways. But when we were moving around the country physically a lot, we were also freeing ourselves to construct the identities that we wanted, to rise above our station, to have the temerity to want better for ourselves and for our children. That there was something really magical about that. It drew people from all over the world. It gave America a really distinctive degree of social and economic mobility. But it was founded on that geographic mobility, the remarkable granting of a right which said you could live someplace just because you want to. I know how central this right is in part because of how much we denied it to different Americans in different times and places, most notably through slavery. I mean, the enslavement is literally the denial of mobility, and you can watch the enslaved contest for their own freedom through the exercise of mobility by running away from captivity. And so mobility has been this really core American value, the thing on which our other freedoms are fundamentally founded. And the central contention of the book is it made a lot of people really uncomfortable, and that we have spent 100 years in a tug of war over mobility. And over the last 50 years, those who believe that communities should get to choose their members rather than that individuals should get to choose their communities have been winning. That we broke something that we took for granted, that was almost invisible to us, that we didn't even realize we were losing. And as it has eroded over the last 50 years, it has broken many of the other much more visible features of American society that help define the American character and that Americans treasure. That's the claim of the book.
Is this a kind of anti-communitarian take then?
Specifically? It's not anti-communitarian in the sense that part of the counterintuitive argument of the book is the reason that American communities were long the envy of the world, the reason that people came over from Europe and kept marveling at our civic life, at our voluntary associations.
Yeah, this is like Tocqueville. Yeah.
Yeah, all of Tocqueville says this, but everybody who comes over here, Bryce says that, like, you can go through one European travelogue after another, and they all say two things about us. They say we have a national defect in our character, that we are insufficiently attached to home and place, that, Tocqueville says we're restless in the midst of prosperity, that we have enough and yet we're not satisfied with it. We strive for something more. They're very disquieted by this. We don't know our place. We don't know our station. And the other thing they say is, gosh, we're incredibly jealous of this rich civic life. You walk into an American church and it's full of actual believers. There are things about chosen communities that are much more vital than inherited communities. And by the way, that choice doesn't mean that you can't choose to be a vital and active participant in your inherited community. It's that it becomes a choice. Even the choice to stay where you are, even the choice to accept your inherited identities becomes something that you are actively committing to, and therefore tend to value much more. So it's not anti-communitarian in the sense that I think that the vitality of American communities comes from their chosen nature. What it is anti-localist. It says, if you allow communities to operate as members-only clubs, which is how they originally operated in this country and in the old world, then you allow the people who have the most to shut out the people who have less. You allow them to discriminate against disfavored groups. And in every time and place, that is how that will operate. And I think largely unconsciously, we have gone back to a system that allows those who have a lot to shut out those who have less.
Can I ask an interesting theory of the case, just hearing you talk there? Was there something inherent in Americans that made us move, or was it things that were driving us? That is to say, is there something in the American character that's sort of baked into us, or is it a circumstance? So, I mean, to even extend the question, it's is the desire to not move, a product of Europeanness, or a product of sort of European, like, geographic and, like, economic development? You know what I mean? So, to put it even more pointedly, is there something about early America that drove people to move, to seek that? Is it a certain kind of precariousness, perhaps, that and obviously opportunity as well, coupled with precariousness, that drove people to? And you noted in the book that moving is painful. It's not. Yes. It's not. Just happiness and roses. Oh, I'm going to move to a new town. It's actually it's costly. It's difficult. It uproots you. So is there a theory of the case to say that as we become more prosperous, that we become more sedentary, if you will? Or is there something about the American character that we've lost, as you've just put it in the thing, that it could be both? Anyway, just take that however you want.
Yeah, like, just to heighten that a little bit, like, one of the things I kept thinking about in the book is, like, is this about an intrinsic feature of America that, like, is just a defining characteristic, or is this actually a debate about young versus middle-aged societies and how they develop over time?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think it's exactly the right question. And to some extent, it's an unanswerable question, right? Like, we're going to find out over the next century. But I do think we can hint at answers, at least by thinking about where the mobility came from. That is, the thing that the Europeans and other contemporary American observers are so disquieted by is that in most times and places, moving is an act of the desperate and the destitute. You move when you have no choice. And that is how they understood mobility. That is, you're tied to a particular place unless you're going to risk it all on a mad throw of the dice and go someplace else because you have no possibility of survival even where you are. What Americans do, and in part because we are a nation of people who came to this country from elsewhere, is they redefine their society to make mobility central to the American experience. And so, that there is a set of economic incentives that helps make that happen. Certainly in the early colonial phase, the abundance of land that was there just as fast as you could dispossess its rightful owners is something which plays a role here. But what's really fascinating about American mobility is that the propensity to move from one place to another has not been highest along the frontier. It's been highest in the built-up places that have been settled for hundreds of years. And so, if I'm trying to come up with a narrative that says America is just more prosperous now, I've got to explain why 1 in 3 Americans is moving in the Gilded Age. I've got to explain why 1 in 5 Americans is still moving in the 1960s and the 1970s during the great boom of post-war prosperity. It does not lead to a sudden fall off in mobility. It leads to a resurgence over the Depression. In times of deprivation, actually, mobility has cranked down a little bit in America. It's often in periods of abundance where people have more opportunity to pursue that you find them moving more. And then I'd have to explain what it is around 1970 that leads to a consistent 50-year slide. And so I do think it's actually largely a cultural feature of American society, which, because we were doing it so often, we then built up an entire society that was economically structured around mobility. The U.S. social welfare state does not look like the European welfare state. It is built around a presumption that labor will relocate toward opportunity, that instead of stretching a safety net because people are going to forever be where they are, and if the jobs disappear from Stuttgart, you have to provide a really robust net because the people are not going to disappear from Stuttgart. In the U.S., the presumption is that if all the farmers leave Ohio in 1820 to move further west, you don't need to provide a robust safety net in Ohio. You just let people move to Indiana. And that is how America works for a really long time. And over the last 50 years, we have a disjuncture where we built a society assuming that people could relocate toward opportunity. And now we don't let them do it in practical terms. And because we don't let them do it, when there are disruptions to the economy, when some industries fade and others rise, instead of the society naturally tending back toward equilibrium, we get prolonged concentrated deprivation and all the anger that comes with it. So we built a society that was characterologically inclined toward mobility. Many Americans still tell you they want to move. The number of Americans who say they want to move but cannot or have not has gone up 45% over this 50-year period, right? There's still a ton of Americans out there who would love to relocate to someplace that offered them more opportunity, despite all of the pain of dislocation. And they can't do it anymore. And that's really interesting to me.
I mean, so Damir, I'll let you jump in a second, but it seems to me that they're like different models. So like there definitely is, and I mean, you do map this out to a degree. I mean, so there definitely is a kind of like allow ourselves to have high degrees of kind of moving mobility, a sense of like not necessarily like long-term family holdings like you would have in Europe. That totally seems right. I was just texting with Damir though before this, like thinking about this Jefferson quote that he gives to Madison, where he says that America will remain virtuous so long as there's an infinite supply of land somewhere within the continent. But then as soon as people start getting stacked up in cities, he thinks that will like start to degrade the republic. And I think his thinking there is actually slightly different than the vision that you're giving, which is that America has enough space to be able to expand outward. And there are also like super tumultuous things like that we all know about how Manifest Destiny actually played out. But I think his picture is actually one of like mobility, but then quasi-permanence, because like you get a holding, which then allows you to have a footing in a particular place. And so you get like a distributed population, but one that is actually anchored in particular. Like the Jeffersonian vision seems like at moments consonant with what you're mapping out, but actually like kind of importantly different in certain places. Does that seem roughly right to you?
Yeah, it does. I think Jefferson is a terrible vision for the nation.
Nice.
He's trying to recreate a European aristocracy on these shores, not a titled aristocracy, but he builds himself a country manor, right? Like and then buys enslaved people to work it for him. I don't think that's a good vision for the country. I don't think that kind of permanent aristocracy works very well, and I think that there's a reason that America abandoned it. But there is this constant tension.
It is an egalitarian version, though. I mean, I think like at least like with a good number of select populations that would not have had access to land in Europe, he does want there to be a kind of equality to that like expansion across the country and having like small holdings and that do allow you local communities.
He's all for the yeoman farmer, and this is one of the wonderful things about Jefferson is that anything you want to condemn about Jefferson, he also believed the opposite, so you can praise him. Jefferson.
Common mistake.
So he does imagine a nation of yeoman farmers, and he imagined it as a settled, pinned down nation, but it doesn't work, right? Like right away, people are moving out of Virginia toward Kentucky, and they keep going west. And then fascinatingly, they keep moving around. The South always has lower rates of mobility than the North does, but it has those lower rates of mobility largely because it has a different system of land tenancy. It has a different social hierarchy, right? The Southern elites are trying to create the kind of stratified aristocratic society that they had left behind in England. In the colonial period, they do it literally with like sartorial laws about how you can dress based on your social rank. Over time, they do it a little less overtly. And today, those differences have been substantially erased. But for a long time, the South is much more sedentary. And as a result, its economy grows a lot slower. It's a less egalitarian society. It absorbs a tiny percentage of the immigrants that the North absorbs. And those features, those sedentary features of Southern society, ultimately cost it the Civil War, right? Like it is not the kind of dynamic society that the North has produced, and the North wins that war, and American society moves in that direction. I'll tell you one other thing, which is, the book gets into the story of Frederick Jackson Turner, and I love this story. He had that Jeffersonian idea that the frontier was the forge of American character, and once we had settled up the frontier, that was it for America. We were kind of out of luck because we were going to become like the cities of Europe, which he just hated. And Turner is doing this based on a census report that has been written by a couple of immigration restrictionists. And one of the things I document in the book that I don't believe has been published previously is that this was data fraud. These guys rigged the map. They doctored it in two different ways. They changed the color scheme on the map, and they literally mark as settled land that is not settled in order to erase the frontier. And they do this overtly because they want to put up a no vacancy signs on America. They want to give Americans the impression that there's no room left in the country, that if you're operating with that Jeffersonian model, that America can only survive as long as there's free land. They want to say there is no free land. It's total fraud. We will settle more farmland in the decade after that report than we had ever settled in a decade before. We're not out of land. But that idea takes hold. Turner writes this famous paper about it, The Closing of the American Frontier, and this thesis takes hold in the American mind that America only works as long as there's free land to settle. In fact, America is going to become unbelievably dynamic in the next decades. It's going to, urbanization is going to proceed apace. We're going to rise to industrial leadership after the First World War. We'll also start to take on a larger global role. There's nothing about American society that peaks with Turner's supposed closing of the frontier, and that is because we remain mobile. We are more mobile in those cities than we had been on the frontier. There is more opportunity for people to rise up through the country than when we were a largely agricultural society. So I think that Jefferson basically gets this backwards, that a nation of smallholding farmers who are permanently tied to the land is a relatively static nation, a stagnant nation, and instead what makes America successful is our mobility.
Well, so can I ask you then, the question that comes to mind then is, again, going back to this thing we're circling around about how American character is formed, and then this, the emergence of these countervailing forces. In many ways, the book is a catalog of the emergence of this, these breaks on this, let's grant, developed American ethos about mobility. What's your theory? Maybe, in the course of answering this, you can sort of give listeners a sense of the story of these countervailing forces against it. But what's your theory of how they emerge? And I guess again, this is maybe a slightly philosophical question. Is what's the role of ideas in sort of shaping this? Where do they come from, and how do they make this American ideal, or put brakes on it or corrupt it in some ways? I think in your telling.
Yeah, American ideals are contested and incompletely fulfilled at any point in time. But one of the things that makes American society so fascinating to me is the nature of those fights. And from the time when we sort of open up mobility at the beginning of the 1800s, when you get, 1 in 3 is just, it's a crazy number. Americans are moving every year. It's incredibly unsettling to some Americans. They have people moving into their neighborhoods who are unlike them. unlike them. They don't look like them. They don't sound like them. They don't eat the same foods they eat. And there are these big questions. What is American society? Is American society fundamentally an Anglo-Saxon society, fundamentally a Protestant society, fundamentally a Christian society? Like, where do you draw the line? Is it white? How do you create a society that is capacious enough for all the people who are filling this continent? And that is a big contested battle. And mobility is the battleground, because very early on, what Americans figure out is that there are certain constraints, constitutional constraints in particular, on what they can do. But if you control the use of land, you can control the population. And so that's where all of these passions get channeled. One of the stories I tell in the book is about the first zoning law in America. And it does not happen where many people might expect it to happen, right? It does not happen in a huge built-up city. It happens in at that point, it's a city, but a relatively small town of Modesto, California, in the years after the gold rush. This is 1885. So lots of Chinese have come over to California, first to work in the gold fields, then on the railroads, and as they're driven out by violence and discrimination, they eventually find a niche. It's a peculiarly Californian niche. So many men have come out to California for the gold rush. They stink. They don't want to do laundry. They consider laundry to be women's work. And you get this great sort of Bay Area entrepreneur solution to this. Uber for laundry. There's a guy who says, I'll solve the problem. Give me your clothes in a bag. I'll put them on a boat here on the dock that'll go to Hawaii where they can do laundry for you. In 6 weeks, you can get a clean shirt back. That's like how crazy the situation is. And the Chinese are like, hey, we'll do the laundry. Like, if you won't let us do anything else, we still want our shot at the American dream, and we'll do the laundry for you. And so the Chinese laundry becomes like the iconic California business. It is pretty much the only thing the Chinese are still allowed to do other than restaurants. And they're like coffee shops. You don't walk past 4 Chinese laundries to get to the 5th. You drop your clothes at the nearest one. So they want to move out into the neighborhoods. They want to be among their customers. And they do that in Modesto. And most people in Modesto are just fine with that, because now they don't have to go as far to get the laundry done. If you've ever walked down 3 flights of stairs to the basement to do your laundry, you know what a pain in the neck this is, right? Like, having the local laundromat, convenient. But the elites in Modesto are not happy about this, and they try all sorts of things to drive the Chinese out of Modesto. The first thing they try is vigilante violence. They put on hoods, they march through Modesto to Chinatown, they smash the windows, they beat people up, they even beat up a police officer who tries to restrain them. That doesn't work. The Chinese will not be driven out. The second thing they try is arson. They try burning down some of the laundries to see if that can get them to leave. And that doesn't work. And then they really take the gloves off and they go for zoning. They draft this statute, which is pretty clever. It doesn't say Chinese. It doesn't say Chinatown. All it says is all of the laundries in Modesto need to move west of the tracks and south of G Street. And I pulled an 1885 map of Modesto, and there's only one block on that map that matches that description, and it says Chinatown on it, right? So this is a ghettoization ordinance. By controlling the use of the land, you can ghettoize the Chinese back in Chinatown and not have to deal with them in white neighborhoods. That is the origin point of American zoning. It's also, when it's upheld by the Supreme Court, a very brave Chinese launderer named Hung Ki challenges this. There ought to be a statue to the guy. It's really crazy to me that he's been forgotten. He's willing to go to jail, gets beaten up in jail for his pains, takes the case, every precedent is on his side, and he loses it in the California Supreme Court. That starts a line of precedents, which ultimately, 40 years later, will lead to the U.S. Supreme Court upholding zoning. So it's not just some obscure, historical precedent. It's actually where the law of zoning in America is founded, with the ghettoization of the Chinese. And I think in that story, you get everything we're talking about, right? The insistence of the Chinese of being able to use their mobility and choose their community, which is a very American thing for them to be doing, and the insistence of some native-born Americans that they shouldn't have the right to do that. And that fight plays out through the courts in the form of zoning.
But, to then I think finish that story for listeners, and then I think we can get into some of the stuff. When you zoom that into the modern stuff, obviously, you tell the story about redlining and basically, the ugly racial history about all of this. But then when you basically, as you said right there, the story is always the same one in kind of microcosm, that even when you get sort of NIMBYism in a way, you still have call them local interests, localists, you call them. I think it was the swarm of localists is the name of one of the chapters, which tells you something about your enmities there. But basically, local interests that want to basically defend the status quo, and it ends up being zoning ends up being a tool for this kind of defense. Again, I think recognizably pretty human. A human impulse in a lot of people, that sort of things like, well, this is my neighborhood, and why do I want to allow this sort of stuff? And it's almost a democratic instinct in a lot of ways, right? Is empowering local people to have their way. But it gets tied up with, basically progressive ideals, I think, in the modern thing. So I don't know if you want to say a few words on that, and we can sort of then talk a little bit about that, because I found that super, super interesting.
So it's a two-beat story, right? That the first part of the story is how we get zoning, which everybody in America, including the people who are advocating it, understood to be unconstitutional 100 years ago. And then a decade after they start, the Supreme Court upholds it, right? So we get zoning. And it spends...
Do you know what basis? Why did SCOTUS accept the practice?
Yeah, they point back to through this line of precedents that traces to Modesto, and they essentially accept a logic. It's not that you couldn't regulate the use of land, but it was under nuisance law. So you could only regulate somebody else's use of their private property if they were doing harm to you. You had to demonstrate the harm. Or a municipality, under what they call the police power, could regulate the health, safety, or welfare of the community. Somebody operating a laundry is not the health, safety, or welfare of the community. It's not a nuisance to anyone. It's a convenience, right?
So that's basically like a liberal conception, which is if you own something, it has like a certain pretty strongly protected sphere of like discretion, freedom over the use of that thing, so long as it's not infringing some other right for another entity. I mean, this is more or less like John Stuart Mill's view about like how individual rights work. It does, again, like as we're saying, like contrast heavily with the like prior European tradition. Maybe I'll just say one thing on that, like which my sense there is that land in most of the like pre-liberal conception is owned but not quite owned. So like the kind of like footpath or public common kind of traditions where you have a certain right of stewardship. You can use it for agriculture, whatever, like in all kinds of ways. But also there are supervenient rights that can come in and break that. So like if a village has used it as a footpath for a certain amount of time, that will become an established right that the landholder actually has to defer to. And then a whole series of other things like this. It's really like, I just wanted to say that quickly because like it seems to me that there's like the backdrop to even the zoning question is like uniquely American.
Yes,
view about ownership, law, property.
Except that the guidelines I'm articulating are English common law. Like they're going back through Blackstone. They're looking at a hundreds-year-old tradition of English common law. And you're right that there is a debate over how far private property rights should go. But whether you're going with a more limited conception of those rights or a more expansive one, there's broad agreement that if I want to build a mill on my property, I can build that mill on my property. I'm not hurting anyone, and that the locality doesn't even have the right to prevent me from doing that because it's not the health, safety, or welfare of the community. So you can talk about how expansive those conceptions are, but it needs to fall within one of those categories. And what happens is that in order to discriminate against the Chinese, California invents a new doctrine. They say, well, there are things that aren't nuisances, but they're very like a nuisance. They're like similar to a nuisance, like an apartment in a neighborhood of single-family homes. And the favorite metaphor here that the Supreme Court uses is, a pig in the parlor but not the barnyard is a proper thing in an improper place. So that's their rationale, right? That you can have a proper thing like a laundry, like a two-family home, and it's in the improper place. And if you unpack that metaphor, what the Supreme Court is saying is some people deserve to live in parlors and others in barnyards, right? Like that's the flip side of this, is that once you allow the state to say certain neighborhoods have to put up with things that other neighborhoods do not have to put up with, largely on the basis of class, and in America that also means on the basis of race, then you are setting up a multi-tier system of property rights in the name of eliminating nuisances, what you're actually doing is creating a graded system where some people have to put up with things in their neighborhoods that others don't. So that, I think, is sort of the big legal turn here. And you get a system of where, over the next 50 years, every act of construction in American, first in a city, and it spreads very, very quickly out to the countryside too. Pretty much anything you want to do on your property becomes subject to government approval. And that in and of itself does not constrain American mobility. Americans keep moving. It's the second turn, starting around, in the 1960s and 70s, where you do start to see the sudden decline in mobility. And it happens because we tighten the rules a lot, and we do something else. We give individuals who have no material interest in the outcome of the decision the right to sue to stop it. They can sue to challenge the procedures under which the government arrived at its decision, even if that decision doesn't hurt them in any way. That's a novel legal right, and it comes out of an attack on government, that is launched from the left. Right, so this is a little counterintuitive. I'm just going to take a second to explain it because I think it gets at some of the big questions here.
Yeah.
What happens is, in the 1950s and 60s, lots of liberals, progressives, whatever label you want to apply here, lots of people on the political left are becoming disenchanted with the New Deal. They see these large government bureaucracies, and they're worried about mass culture. They're worried about bigness in general. And they see big business, big labor, and big government getting in bed together. They believe that big government has been captured by big business, that the regulatory agencies are not doing their job properly, that they are instead catering to businesses that are profit-seeking and hurting the public interest. And the thing is that they are 100% right about this. Right, so like Rachel Carson writes Silent Spring about how this is happening with chemical companies that are producing pesticides that are killing all the birds, and the regulators are asleep at the switch. And Ralph Nader writes Unsafe at Any Speed to say the same thing is happening with auto safety. And they're 100% right about what's happening. Their remedy, though, is not we need bureaucratic reform or we need more democracy. Their remedy is to say what we need to do is to empower individuals with the right through hearings and regulatory review processes to lodge objections. And if that doesn't work, we're going to empower them to go to court to challenge the procedure by which these decisions were arrived at. They imagine people like themselves fighting the good fight, trying to make society more just, more equal. They do not pause to think, and I think largely don't anticipate, that they are handing out a distributed veto that is very unequally exercised. Like if you want to navigate a bureaucratic government procedure and show up at the hearing, we know who shows up at hearings. They are much more, compared to the general population, much more male, whiter, older, richer, likely to be homeowners, and not by small margins, by enormous margins, right? Even compared to the local electorate, which is already like the median local voter is like 65. Even compared to the local electorate, the people who show up at hearings are much more elite, much more affluent, much more likely to be white. And then if you look at the tiny percentage of them who go on to file lawsuits, you are essentially allowing people to disproportionately veto things they don't like based on their wealth, based on their education, based on their social status. And as they do that, they have essentially created a set of tools that operate in practice to make America a much more unequal place, where government is sort of weaponized in favor of people with postgraduate degrees and against those who have the greatest need of the opportunities society once provided.
So, this gets at the I think, to me, the juiciest part of all of this, and, how it then ends up bleeding into today's moment. We've gone through several years now of theorizing a lot of this sort of stuff as stakeholder capitalism versus shareholder capitalism. This whole sort of idea of multiple stakeholders coming into these decisions, that you can't have this sort of stuff. And I think you even pointed out at some point when you're talking about Nader's work, specifically on housing in California, that there's a real hostility against growth. Yes. as a concept. And real, again, I think, as you laid out just now, justified suspicion of the profit motive and big corporations having, corrupted government and taken it away from the people. But nevertheless, there is a profound suspicion of growth and business, and basically sort of a capitalist suspicion there. And I guess the thing I'd press you on then is in today's moment, as Democrats are again sort of like reeling against this sort of stuff, is that part of the critique that Democrats should sort of have, in the back of their mind about the question of how are we setting up the incentives to write these things? I don't know if you've seen it. I think it came out 2 days ago. I sent it to Sam. There was an article by Reihan Salam in City Journal, and it was mostly, I think, going, at least theoretically, at Ezra Klein's book. But it was about housing. So it dovetails. I think that where you come down in the book is not nearly as vulnerable to Reihan's point, but I'd still put it to you, is this question of the profit motive and how do we get out of this problem, right? Reihan's point is that as long as liberals, as long as Democrats are saying, yes, we have a problem here. We have a problem of incentives that have been set up through all sorts of reasons, and we need to be conscious of it, and through consciousness we can address this through policy. He'll put out that basically, as long as you don't have an idea, theory of the case, or like a political economy theory of the case of how we get here, you're going to end up with the kind of stuff like, yes, we need to do better, but it's still in this sort of stakeholder thing. And as you're seeing in California at this point, still a lot of horse trading. Like, well, we'll let you build, but you have to hire union labor. You have, and you list a lot of this stuff. You have to provide goodies to all sorts of other constituencies, to all sorts of other stakeholders, in order to address in order to address this very concrete thing which we agree needs to be solved. And as a result, because of this sort of horse trading approach, you're not making the moves that you need to do at the speed you need to do to get it. So I don't know, react to any part of that. I mean, I think your book has some of the answers to that, but I want to sort of push you on a lot of that in the sort of as we get deep into it here.
And I mean, okay, so I'm going to sort of give you critique from the left in a second, but like, I guess like part of what I was wondering about when Damir and I were texting about this specific question is like, how much is there like a libertarian strand that's actually running through some of this argument, and like how much do you want to bite that bullet? Like, the Reihan thing is pushing Ezra and Derek to say like, yeah, okay, like actually the only way that you can get this done is to like go in hard on big corporate developers who are going to build ugly luxury apartments everywhere and like whatever, because there's a strong profit motive for that. So like the question of like, when you're trying to correct the kind of cramped and overly controlled housing thing, does that then just mean you go in for free market, like large scale corporate models?
Yeah, I'm very interested in profit, but the kind of wealth I'm interested in is the common wealth. I think that the way to think about this is that markets do some things really, really well. I think I can rely on developers to be greedy. Like I think that's a good bet to make. And
is it a healthy bet to make though? That's the
right.
question,
So that's the question, right? Like, one of the question always is I'm not a libertarian. I believe that markets work best when they are strongly regulated by the state in the common interest. And I don't think that our housing market is currently strongly regulated by the state in the common interest. I think that states have delegated that power down to localities, which is a relatively novel development. The localities have then effectively delegated that to some of their most affluent and oldest members. And as a result, we have a profoundly anti-democratic regulatory state, which is no longer serving most Americans terribly well at all. And so I think that we can rely on markets to pursue profit. And with smart regulation, you can channel those profit motives to serve the public interest and curb their excesses. And then you can also tax the people who are profiting off of it and redistribute some of those gains to ameliorate the inequities. Like I believe in that, and I believe that will work for housing. I'll say something else too. There's a guy at Harvard named Benjamin Friedman who has written this sort of an interesting strain of work that argues that the fundamental prerequisite for sort of a pluralistic liberal democracy is growth. It is really, really hard to maintain the kind of social consensus that we require in order to be tolerant of our differences, in order to avoid tribalism, in an atmosphere in which we think that resources are fixed, or worse, that they are diminishing. People start hunkering down. They start growing suspicious of each other, and liberal democracy tends to fall apart. Whether or not I wish that is the case, I'm fairly compelled that by his argument that it has historically been the case. And I think you can see some of these dynamics around housing, honestly, where when we lived in a society that was providing constantly lots of new housing by greedy developers who were seeking profit, and often not by large corporate developers. Much of the new housing in cities was built by immigrants who faced endemic labor market discrimination and found that the real estate sector, construction, was one place where they could be their own boss and therefore find opportunity in the face of such discrimination.
Immigrants like Trump's dad, right?
Immigrants like Trump's dad, right? Like he there was a lot of anti-German discrimination, right? Like you know, in New York, most of that real estate sector is Jewish, and the reason for that was, like, in those years, the Jews could not become lawyers or doctors, or like the smart entrepreneurial Jews went into real estate because it was one place they didn't face the same kinds of labor discrimination, and so other immigrant communities have followed them, right? Like, real estate does not have to be a large corporate sector, but when they were out there and they were building, what we got was an atmosphere in which most Americans expected that their next house would be better than their last house. And they also saw, and this was true, I think, in America for about 400 years, Americans believed in growth because they believed that if their communities were thriving, their own opportunities increased. And that they would have a better life for themselves and a better life for their kids. That they had an orientation toward the collective interest that came out of that belief that growth was possible, right? Like for a long time, medieval Europe, there was not a belief in growth, and there wasn't growth. And so it really is this atmosphere of economic growth which enables us to be more open and to be more accepting and tolerant. Many of the things I value about America come out of that historic American commitment to growth. When the left turns against growth in the 1970s, it does so largely for some very good reasons, right? Like there's rampant pollution and environmental degradation. For some very bad reasons, there's a lot of terrible social science about population growth and its likely trajectory and consequences that turns out to be just like flat wrong.
Neo-Malthusian stuff, yeah.
Yeah,
Actually,
you know,
we had an amazing conversation with Martha Nussbaum on this podcast like a year ago, maybe, where it was like being thrown back into that era of liberalism, where like she really did consider population growth to be like the great sin, and was talking about reproductive control, like all of this kind of stuff. And I was with Shadi, and I just both sat there like looking at each other like, wow, this is amazing. It's like being like in an artifact museum from some totally different time of conversation.
But it still persists, is what you're saying, though. I mean, in some ways, it's still there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, when I talked to the Nader's Raider, who rewrote the land laws in California, I asked him, like, do you have any regrets about what you did, that you shut off California as this mecca of opportunity? And he said, no, I happen to have a philosophical belief that there's too many goddamn people. And I thought, well, you know, there it is. You know, if you are in fact an anti-humanist, then you will in fact want to deny other people opportunity because you think there's too many of them, and that is what happens.
And it's faddish today, right? We have this like modern degrowth thing that the kids are talking about these days. It's madness. It's absolute madness, as far as I'm concerned. But it's there. It's persistent and there. And environmentalism also, I mean, is tied to a lot of these sorts of conceits, right? Now, this is not to say, Yoni, that like there isn't a good way to regulate this. I'm not saying, contra Sam. I don't want us to set up like two false, straw men here on either side, which say like either you're a libertarian or you're a degrowth person. It's certainly not that. There's a massive lane in the middle there to go through. But I guess I want to nudge you before Sam gets at you from the left, though, is that the correction, as you qualified it earlier, you can even have all sorts of tax regimes and abilities to redistribute. You can even have laws that constrict the kind of building, so it's not just completely madness. You're not descending into slumlordism. But a very basic thing, which I believe is in your book, right, is that even on the idea of letting developers build in a city, and the profit motive gets them to build high-end stuff. What that ends up doing is it actually, in a very interesting way, it ends up depressing values of the entire stock of property in a city. If here in D.C. we allowed basically much more building, your house, my house, they'd be worth less over time, and therefore, it would be more affordable to people to move in over time because it's a supply and demand sort of thing. So, it's still that it feels to me like on the broad left, there needs to be a correction towards recognizing that, what you were just saying, the importance of growth, and at least grappling with some of the incentives towards that, away from this idea of ultra-democratic stakeholder approach to these sorts of things. That we have to poll all the stakeholders for what they want, and then we can technocratically arrive at the best solution. And there are easier ways to sort of at least approach growth from a policy side. I mean, where am I too far to the right for you there, basically, is my question.
That's it for part one, dear listeners. There's a lot more where that came from. If you're not yet a paying subscriber, please head on over to wisdomofcrowds.live and become one. Help support our work. Hope to see you in the bonus.